So Psalm 145. I will extol you, my God and King, and bless your name forever and ever. Every day I will bless you and praise your name forever and ever. Great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised, and his greatness is unsearchable. One generation shall commend your works to another, and shall declare your mighty acts. On the glorious splendor of your majesty, and on your wondrous works I will meditate. They shall speak of the might of your awesome deeds, and I will declare your greatness. They shall pour forth the fame of your abundant goodness, and shall sing aloud of your righteousness. The Lord is gracious and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. The Lord is good to all, and his mercy is over all that he has made. All your works shall give thanks to you, O Lord, and all your saints shall bless you. They shall speak of the glory of your kingdom and tell of your power, to make known to the children of man your mighty deeds and the glorious splendor of your kingdom. Your kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and your dominion endures throughout all generations. The Lord is faithful in all his words and kind in all his works. The Lord upholds all who are falling and raises up all who are bowed down. The eyes of all look to you, and you give them their food in due season. You open your hand, you satisfy the desire of every living thing. The Lord is righteous in all his ways and kind in all his works. The Lord is near to all who call on him, to all who call on him in truth. He fulfills the desire of those who fear him. He also hears their cry and saves them. The Lord preserves all who love him, but the wicked he will destroy. My mouth will speak the praise of the Lord, and let all flesh bless his holy name forever and ever. Well, it'd be a great help if you kept that open as we open up this evening. Muhammad Ali called himself the greatest. And it would be fair to say that he is widely regarded as one of the most significant sports figures of the 20th century. And few would dispute that he was the greatest heavyweight boxer of all time. He held the ring heavyweight title from 1964 to 1970. He was the undisputed world champion from 1974 to 1978, and the WBA and ring heavyweight champion from 1978 to 1979. In 1999, he was named Sportsman of the Century by Sports Illustrated magazine, and in the same year, he was awarded Sports Personality of the Century by the BBC. Muhammad Ali said this ahead of his world title fight with George Foreman: "I float like a butterfly, I sting like a bee. His hands can't hit what his eyes can't see. Now you see me, now you don't. George thinks he will, but I know he won't." A great boxer he may be. A great poet? Well, I'll let you make your own mind up about that. By contrast, in Psalm 145, we are looking together at a poem, a song of praise to the one whose greatness blows any achievements of Muhammad Ali, or indeed any other human being, clean out the window. But before we get into it, let's just start with a little bit of context. Psalm 145 is the last acrostic psalm. That means that each line begins with the next letter of the alphabet. Hence my title of the A to Z of praise. You'll be pleased to hear there's not 26 points this evening. And it's most likely, though, David's last psalm. and it sets up the final batch, 146 to 150, which are all psalms of praise. But there's a sense as you read through it that David is looking back over his life, and he's marveling at the greatness and the goodness of God. Not just marveling himself, but also showing us how all of creation joins with him in offering praise to the Almighty. So first of all, we see a personal commitment in verses 1 to 3. I will extol you, he says, my God and King, and bless your name forever and ever. Every day I will bless you and praise your name forever and ever. Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised, and his greatness is unsearchable. You see, so much has happened in David's life. The shepherd boy who defeated Goliath, his anointing by Samuel, often on the run from King Saul, his friendship with Jonathan, that whole messy chapter in his life with Bathsheba, crushing military victories, crowned king of Judah, crowned king of Israel, and a family that ultimately betrays him. So much to look back on. So many good times, and yet also so much pain. And perhaps only a little time ahead of him. The forever and ever in verse 1, repeated in verse 2, literally to the end of my days. David has his eyes on heaven. It's the final lap of what has been an eventful race. Now, David may have been up and down in his dealings with God, but by contrast, God's character never wavers. And it's God's character that we see in Psalm 145 that inspires David. Now, you can tally up the world titles held by a champion boxer. You can count the goals scored by Lionel Messi. You can put a stopwatch on Usain Bolt, and you can measure their greatness. But how do you measure the greatness of the one who put the stars and planets in the sky? The one who fills the oceans with water, the one who fills the storehouses with snow. As God said to Job in Job 38, 4-6, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid the cornerstone? The answer to all of those is God, and God alone. But can you get your head around the immensity of God's greatness? David couldn't, and I certainly can't, and I'm not sure we're meant to. I think if we can, then we're probably thinking God is much smaller than he actually is. You see, God's greatness, well, it deserves the open-mouthed amazement of the impossible drop shot on centre court at Wimbledon, the 25-yard putt on the 18th green at Augusta, the Shane Warne ball of the century to Mike Gatting. God's greatness should leave us shaking our heads in wonder time after time after time. And as we move into verse 4, God's greatness, well, it transcends David's here and now to reach through time. You see, David's perspective from the start was for the rest of his days, but now he draws in the generations of God's people, because God's greatness is not limited to one lifetime. It reaches instead from one generation to the next. That's in verses 4-9. One generation shall commend your works to another and shall declare your mighty acts. On the glorious splendor of your majesty and on your wondrous works I will meditate. They shall speak of the might of your awesome deeds, and I will declare your greatness. You see, David wants the wonderful works, the mighty acts that God has performed to be ever present on the lips, not just in their minds, but on the lips of the people who heard him. Because for them, their thoughts would pop immediately from Genesis to Exodus, from the mighty acts of creation, right the way through to the redemption of God's people in the Exodus, taken from Egypt. Now, since birth, they would have been told of those first 6 days, how God made the earth and the planets, the trees, the plants, the animals, the birds, how he filled the seas, and of course, how he made man in his own image. These were the lifeblood of Israelite boys and girls, deeply rooted in their DNA. The Exodus, full of tales that were well known to his hearers. People from their families had been there, suffered under Egyptian rule, been brought out of slavery, been rescued, had even seen the waves crashing over Pharaoh's army. And now it's their turn to pass these accounts on to the next generation, to point a finger to the star-filled sky, the sand beneath their feet, to remind them of God's promises to Abraham, of the role that they and their children and their children's children are going to play in God's great story. There's echoes too, isn't there? James made reference to this a couple of weeks ago, to the fathers addressed in Deuteronomy 6. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. And it's a challenge to us too, isn't it? But what a way as a family to praise God, to teach these truths to our children. Dads in particular, that's one of your privileges. If you don't talk about the amazing works of God, who will? Their schools. In this day and age, I'll be surprised. Christian teachers do an absolutely amazing job, but their hands are being tied by red tape and legislation. If our children are to have any chance, then we simply must pass these truths on to the next generation. Because above all else, they reveal the character of God. We don't want our children to grow up thinking that God is distant and detached. He's not a rock or a statue or a painting. He's not a historical figure like Napoleon or Boudica or Julius Caesar to be studied dispassionately. No, these awesome works of God's creation and his rescue, they remind us of his greatness, of the times that he's intervened for his people, when he's heard their cries. But just as importantly, they tell of his goodness, of how he's a God who delights to be in relationship with us. Now look down with me at these familiar words in verses 7 and 8. They shall pour forth the fame of your abundant goodness. They shall sing aloud of your righteousness. The Lord is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. David has lifted these words in verse 8 from Deuteronomy 34. Now, as you know, the word love can mean many things in the Bible. But here, this is the word for a loyal love, a faithful love, a keeper of promises love, a steadfast love. These works that God has performed provide the hearers with a confidence that God can and will act for them as he promises to. Guaranteed, because he has that proven track record. He did it before. He'll do it again because he loves his people and he wants to see them saved. And it's made all the more amazing because of his grace. You see that in verse 8? That undeserved kindness, that suspension of the anger that we do deserve. We're fragile and broken people. God is anything but that. Well, if the camera lens started tight on David and his personal praise before widening out to include the next generation of Israelites of the Exodus, the shot now expands once again to incorporate, thirdly, all who have faith in him. Have a look at verse 10 and 11. All your works shall give thanks to you, O Lord, and all your saints shall bless you. They shall speak of the glory of your kingdom and tell of your power. All believers throughout history are now praising God's greatness. And this language of all God's people praising his eternal kingdom, it's a foretaste of heaven, isn't it? We've been looking at Revelation again in the mornings, but let's have a look at Revelation 7. Here it is, it's on the screen. After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb." It's an amazing picture, isn't it? It's gold standard church, the thing we're all looking forward to. But David wants us to be like this now. Because of the reason that verses 10 and 11 are there, the reason that we speak of this wonderful kingdom is because they lead us into verses 12 and 13. Verse 12, to make known to the children of man your mighty deeds and the glorious splendor of your kingdom. Your kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and your dominion endures throughout all generations. We're to tell of God's glory and might, to make God's mighty deeds known to everyone. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember the 1980s film Brewster's Millions. It's a terrible film, don't bother watching it. Loosely, the plot is that the main character, Brewster, is a down-at-heel minor league baseball player. Now, he inherits $30 million from an unknown uncle, and he's been given 30 days to get rid of all of that money, to spend it, to have nothing left. And if he does that, then he'll inherit another $300 million. Well, unsurprisingly, it goes right the way down to the wire, but he just about makes it and thwarts some greedy lawyers to achieve the target. It is a lightweight film, but in the context of Psalm 145, it reminds us that as Christians, what we have in the gospel is a real treasure. It's gold dust, but it's not something we should be clinging on to. We're not to be miserly about it. It's a kind of treasure that brings untold riches to all who possess it. So our job is to share it. Many more of you will know the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who refused to worship the golden statue of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. As a result, they were thrown into the fiery furnace. And yet they survived without the slightest trace of burning. And of all people, unbelievably, Nebuchadnezzar seems to get it. He saw this mighty work of God's hands, and he immediately wants to share the amazing news with everyone. He sends out a proclamation to his entire kingdom. This is from Daniel 4. King Nebuchadnezzar, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. It has seemed good to me to show the signs and wonders that the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation. David, it seems, was so impressed by Nebuchadnezzar that he quotes those lines about God's eternal kingdom in Psalm 145. Sharing the hope of an everlasting kingdom is the greatest kindness we can ever perform for our family, our friends, our co-workers. Hope of a spiritual kingdom that is beyond Israel, beyond all the earth, a kingdom which we see glimpses now through the church. Some victories over sin, victories over opposition to the gospel, victories over disease, which do not run completely unchecked. Now, we may not have all the answers to people's questions, but even just sharing that great miracle of your own conversion story is a powerful testimony. As Christians, we've been promised a home in an everlasting kingdom, ruled by a loving and compassionate God who holds all power, all things in his hands. That is surely something we could all be shouting about. And then finally, the camera pans back further again until the full panorama is revealed, where fourthly, every creature praises God. Well, in the second half of this psalm, David sort of flips things around. The ones doing the praising come at the beginning of the end of the section, rather. In this case, verse 21, let all flesh bless his holy name forever and ever. So this is all of creation, blessing God. This then is followed by the reasons. You may be visiting here this evening, and perhaps you're still thinking over the claims of Christianity, looking for answers to big questions about life. If you are, then I'm really glad you came. You're really welcome. I've been in your shoes myself. Nearly all of us have at some point. And if that is you, then I want you to know two things from these final verses, two things that are 100% reliable, not just spin, no small print. Firstly, I want you to be sure that God will keep all of his promises. Look at the way that David bookends these amazing truths in verses 14 to 16 with this repeated line that the Lord is faithful in verses 13 and 17. God is true to his word. He's promised salvation to his people, and he will keep his promises no matter how unlikely they seem. Nothing in heaven or on earth can prevent God from accomplishing all that he has promised his people through Jesus Christ. I've sat in churches and I've been turned off by what's being said because it can feel like an exclusive club, members only. But reading verses 14 to 19 can put that notion to bed. So secondly, when God says that he cares for all of his creation, that includes you, and we can be sure that every word is true. Have a look, verse 14. The Lord upholds all who are falling and raises up all who are bowed down. The eyes of all look to you. You give them their food in due season. You open your hand. You satisfy the desire of every living thing. The Lord is righteous in all his ways, kind in all his works. The Lord is near to all who call on him, to all who call on him in truth. He fulfills the desire of those who fear him. He also hears their cry and saves them. One of the images the Bible often uses to illustrate God's faithfulness is in likening it to the way that a father has compassion on his children. Tragically, it's not always the case, but most parents naturally have feelings of love attachment, care, and commitment towards each of their children. This doesn't change, regardless of how many times the child disobeys or disappoints. And in just the same way that a parent might tend to their children, so too God cares for his creation, all of it. How many times does he mention the word all in 13b to 20? 11. God's faithfulness includes this tender, unbreakable, and compassionate care for all, and that includes you. In verse 14, he offers you a steadying hand, and he strengthens you when you feel burdened. Verse 15, he feeds you when you're hungry. Verse 16, he is abundant in his generosity to every living thing, including you. Verse 18, he comforts you when you call to him. Verse 19, he offers you hope when you're fearful, and he will save you when you turn to him. We've seen this week the fallout from the American election. One side is weeping and wailing as though the end of the world is coming. The other side is hailing the victor as some all-conquering Messiah. Well, the simple truth is that the Messiah has already come. And if you haven't yet called out to God for forgiveness, can I urge you to do that today? As part of his creation, God cares for you immeasurably. King Jesus left his throne in heaven to come into the world to save flawed people like you and like me from an eternity of separation from God, separation from his boundless loving kindness and care. Verse 19 is his rescue mission. He hears their cry and he saves them. You see, we can measure God's greatness. His greatness is seen in the greatest, most loving, and most gracious act in human history. An act that can be measured in the stretch of a man's arm from here to here, fixed to a cross by a handful of nails. Muhammad Ali was indeed one of the greatest boxers to have lived. But by the time he died, he'd become a tragic shadow of himself, ravaged by Parkinson's and brain injury caused by many years in the ring. We're very quick, aren't we, to put sportsmen and women, musicians, social media influencers onto pedestals of greatness. But all these rise and fall. They wither and perish like grass. By Christ's death, the punishment we deserve for our rejection of God's rule was taken onto him. By his resurrection, we are promised to be raised again. If we sincerely call on him, then we will receive the sure and certain hope of this everlasting kingdom. Psalm 145 clearly tells us why we've been placed on earth. We've been placed on earth to be personally blown away by the greatness of God. And because we're blown away by the greatness of God, we live for his glory and not for our own. We can't help but pass that picture of God's greatness down to the next generation. Surely there is nothing better than to see family or friends also blown away, overwhelmed, mystified, in wonder and awe at God's glory. And he's created a world that so readily reveals his glory. There are plenty of opportunities for us to point to it. Let me pray.